Vivek, can we start?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Please go ahead.
So, yeah, so good evening, everybody, and I again welcome you today to the fifth series of our inaugural Asian Cardio-Oncology Society conference. Today we have exciting sessions lined up, and I would invite our first sessions chairperson, Dr. Ghanshyam Bishwas, to kindly, start the proceedings. Thank you.
Yeah, good evening all, and thanks Vivek. So wonderful job, buddy. And this is the fifth in the series. And Durga Puja, in fact, is the Sashti. So yellow is the code. So that's my that's the code. So we start the ball rolling for the series for fifth of Asian Cardio Oncologist meeting, and we have a keynote speaker, Dr. Teres Lopez Fernandez, and she leads the cardiac imaging unit and cardio oncology. So in India, probably I don't think we have a dedicated cardio oncology unit at this moment. She's from La Paz University from Madrid, Spain. So whoever has gone to Madrid, Spain, so beautiful city, country. So focus is on diagnosis and treatment of cardiac complications of cancer therapies and cardiac imaging. She holds a post of secretary in the ESC Council of Cardio-Oncology and leads the Spanish chapter of International Oncology Society. So over to you, Dr. Teresa, for
Dear colleagues, first of all, I want to thank the organizing committee for the opportunity to be here with you. These are my disclosure. My name is Teresa Lopez, and I work at La Paz Hospital in Madrid, Spain. And it's my pleasure to present you during the next minute this work, the first publication of CardioTox registry at the European Heart Journal. And this project was born at La Paz Hospital 10 years ago. CardioTox registry is a prospective, multidisciplinary, and multi-center registry aimed at defining the factors related with the risk of cancer therapy-induced heart failure and assessing the utility of clinical, biochemical, and echo parameters for the early detection of cardiovascular disease in patients treated with cancer therapies, as well as the possible factors related with prognosis and recovery of left ventricular function. So 7 hospitals participated in the study, including patients according to a pre-established protocol, and each center should have at least 1 cardiologist and 1 oncologist or hematologist actively involved in cancer follow-up enrollment. So we prospective include adult patients receive at least one of these medications with an expected survival of over 6 months. Patient selection and oncologic treatment were determined by the responsible oncologist or hematologist. And study data were collected and management using REDCap platform, and this tool is hosted at EDPath Research Institute in Madrid. So patients were treated following a cancer and heart failure guidelines according to the best criteria of the patient responsible physician, and special care was given to the identification and control of cardiovascular risk factors. So a total of 1,324 patients were included in our study. This is the protocol that we established. And as you can see here, we have 7 visits through 2 years. And we were focused in all the visits on clinical history, physical exam, blood pressure control, ECG, echo, and NT-proBNP monitoring. So we want to define and to grade cardiotoxicity based on current heart failure criteria and to determine the prevalence of common clinical, biochemical, and echo parameters currently accepted as indicative of cardiac toxicity, and this is the main goal of this first publication. So in order to increase our sensitivity to organize a new classification of cardiac toxicity, we decided to exclude patients with the previous heart failure and ejection fraction below 40% or those with incomplete data during the first month of follow-up. And finally, we have a population of 865 patients that were considered for this analysis with a median follow-up of 24 months. So the median age of our population is 55 years old, and 84% of our patients were women. These are the main demographic characteristics, and 8.5% of patients has previous history of cancer, and half of them have received chemo with a low percentage of previous radiotherapy. This large core of patients treated with a potentially cardiotoxic regimen showed a significant prevalence of cardiovascular risk factor at baseline and also significant incidence during the follow-up. And regarding cardiac medication at baseline, 16% of them were under ACE inhibitors or ARB therapies, and also the same percentage with statin therapy. And if we focus on the cancer characteristic, most of the patients suffer from breast cancer with a low percentage of patients with non-Hodgkin lymphoma and Hodgkin lymphoma, and a really low percentage of other malignancies. And most of our patients were treated with anthracyclines, and 16% of them with anthracycline in combination with anti-HER2 therapies. At baseline, we found myocardial dysfunction in a small percentage of our population with a mean ejection fraction of 64% and a mean GLS of minus 19%. And as you can see here, a low percentage of patients have an increase in cardiac troponin or NT-proBNP at baseline. Cardiac toxicity was defined in presence of new or worsened myocardial damage during follow-up by the presence of abnormal values of biomarkers, left ventricular function parameters, and clinical symptoms. And cardiac toxicity was also classified in different stage, mild, moderate, or severe, according to the worst myocardial injury observed. And a cardiac toxicity harm point is defined by all cause of death, cardiovascular death, and heart failure hospitalization as a generally accepted composite endpoint in heart failure trials. So we decided to outline 4 mutually exclusive degrees of myocardial injury that are shown in this graph that may require different treatment recommendations according to heart failure guidelines. So patients were classified as normal or mild cardiotoxicity when ejection fraction was over 50%, but we are able to detect other abnormalities at echo or an increase in cardiac biomarkers. Cardiotoxicity was defined as moderate in patients with an ejection fraction between 40 and 50%, and severe in patients with symptomatic heart failure or those with an ejection fraction below 40%. In addition, we explore and we compare our classification to a recently published proposal from the Cardio-Oncology Royal Brompton Group. And this classification is very interesting and very useful for the clinical point of view because they stratify 6 degrees of severity of the myocardial damage, and according to the degree of damage, they recommend an oncology strategy and also a cardiology preventive strategy, both directed to minimize the interruption of cancer therapy. And this is our results. Patients with cardiotoxicity in our population were older and more likely to have a previous history of cancer or previous anti-cancer drugs or radiotherapy, and presented at baseline with lower ejection fraction and global longitudinal strain. However, baseline NT-proBNP values or baseline cardiac troponin were not related with an excess in cardiotoxicity risk. The risk of moderate to severe cardiotoxicity differ among cancer type, being more common severe cardiotoxicity in patients with non-Hodgkin lymphoma and acute leukemia and colorectal cancer, whereas breast cancer patients are more prone to develop minor forms of cardiotoxicity. Abnormal values of biomarkers and advanced echo parameters at any time during follow-up were found in around 80% of patients. Many of the biomarkers and echo parameters abnormalities were transient, with a peak around 6 months after you start anti-cancer drugs. And although natriuretic peptides are usually considered very important monitoring tool in patients with heart failure, in our study, they do not give us much information in order to predict the risk of cardiotoxicity. This figure summarizes the cumulative prevalence of the main representative myocardial damage parameters described in the literature: cardiac troponin, global longitudinal strain, and ejection fraction. And as you can see there, most of patients experience an increase in cardiac troponin or a decrease in ELS, but the percentage of patients who suffer significant decrease in ejection fraction was lower than in other series. And we can discuss this fact later, but probably it's because all these patients are followed on a cardio-oncology environment. And when we detect small problems in a cardiac function, we try to start cardioprotective treatment. So this table details the prevalence and different grades of myocardial impairment through the study. 16 patients, only 16 patients do not present any clinical, analytical, or echo abnormalities during the follow-up, and 91% present only mild left ventricular dysfunction, and the percentage of moderate or severe cardiotoxicity was much lower. These are the Sankey curves showing the number of patients in each category at baseline and during follow-up. As you know, in this flow diagram, the width of the band are linearly proportional to the prevalence of myocardial damage. And at the end, when we compare our cardiotox classification and the Royal Broughton classification, the percentage of patients with mild form of cardiotoxicity are the group most prevalent during the follow-up. So if we define cardiotoxicity as a worsening of myocardial function, 62% of patients did not suffer any impairment during follow-up. However, we found a high incidence of patients with any degree of worsening ventricular function during high-risk chemo. And most of the case will fulfill the criteria of mild cardiotoxicity and only 3% moderate and severe cardiotoxicity. Probably this low prevalence of moderate to severe cardiotoxicity may partially explained by the fact that we exclude patients with previous heart failure or severe left ventricular dysfunction. Besides the management of cancer patients in the context of an integrated cardio-oncology service may considerably improve also the clinical outcomes. And it is plausible that early identification and treatment of minor forms of cardiac toxicity minimize the risk of moderate to severe cardiac toxicity. And during the follow-up, in fact, a huge number of patients increase the adherence to cardiovascular protective drugs. And if we use this combined endpoint of mortality, you can see here that only patients who develop severe cardiac toxicity experience a significantly increased risk of all cause of mortality or heart failure hospitalization. And if we use our CardioTox classification, or if we use the Royal Brompton classification, the results are quite similar. Of course, this study, as all the registries, has several limitations because patients with abnormal biomarkers and echo values at baseline were excluded. We also exclude patients with previous heart failure or severe left ventricular dysfunction who do not have a central echo lab. And as in other registries, there is a number of missing data during the follow-up that probably reduces the target population. But at the end, we propose a new cardiac toxicity definition and to try to grade the severity of cardiac toxicity based on current heart failure guidelines in order to be able to optimize cardioprotective therapies according to current heart failure guidelines criteria. One important message is that there is a high incidence of patients with worsening ventricular function, and severe cardiac toxicity is related with a 10-fold increase in total mortality compared with patients without or milder form of cardiac toxicity. So the identification of mild forms of cardiac toxicity seems to be critical for the long-term follow-up of cancer survivors. Next step, okay, we need to still analyze data, imaging data. We are also working on genetic predisposition in order to be able to build a robust cardiac toxicity risk score. And I invite you all to join us October 1st at the Virtual Cardio Oncology Summit. And thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Teresa, for such a wonderful talk.
That was.
So I don't know if there are any questions in the chat box.
So you're right, there are no questions.
Okay.
With Vivek sir's permission, I'll move on to the next session. And also with your permission, Ghanshyam sir.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Ghanshyam sir. Thank you, Teresa ma'am, for the wonderful session. We'll move on to our next part. Over to the panel discussion. Our chairperson is Dr. J.P. Agarwal, Senior Radiation Oncologist from Mumbai. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us for this meeting. Our moderator is Dr. Sapna Nangia, Senior Radiation Oncologist from Chennai. And our panelists are Dr. Sayan Das, Radiation Oncologist from Delhi, Dr. Kaustav Talpatra, Radiation Oncologist from Mumbai, Dr. Indu Bansal, Radiation Oncologist from Gurugram, Dr. Prafulla Kerkar, Cardiologist from Mumbai, Dr. Naveen Matthew, Cardiologist from Kochi, Dr. Jesu Krupa, Cardiologist from Vellore. Over to you, Sapna ma'am. Ma'am, are you able to share your screen?
I'll try. Thank you very much for this invitation and for a very topical subject. I must compliment the previous speaker for her very detailed discussion on the subject, which was indeed very, actually made our job a little bit easier. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, ma'am.
Sapna, you have to click on the green share screen button on your computer.
Yes, I know. I have done this in the past, but it seems to be having some issue. Please give me a moment.
Ma'am, you'll have to unmute your mic again. For some reason, you got logged off. Yes, ma'am. Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect, ma'am. Can see the screen.
Wonderful. So we'll start with the topic at hand, which is radiotherapy and the heart, addressing cardiovascular issue. The panel has already been introduced, and I will go straight to the questions that we are interested in. So I'd like to first speak with the radiation oncologists in the panel, and I'll start with Sayan Das. I'd like him to tell us which are the sites where we as radiation oncologists are concerned about the dose to the heart.
Sayan, are you there? Please unmute yourself.
Ma'am, Dr. Sayan has not joined us yet.
So Kaustav can take this question.
Yeah, so three of the major sites of concern primary are breast, radiation of lung, esophagus, any mediastinal tumor, and lymphoma. These are the main sites of concerns.
Yes, so yeah, that's how it is. And today what we will do is I am focusing the discussion primarily on breast and esophageal cancer. Just to kind of put this in perspective, if we look at history of the time when we did not have access to techniques which allowed us to save the heart. For example, in this recent study that has been published of about 2,500 patients treated for Hodgkin's lymphoma, we find that as many as 50% of them at 40 years post-treatment had cardiovascular disease. And as we can see, the orange line here, which is the 50%, which is the mediastinal irradiation plus anthracyclines, really spells out what the issue was. Mediastinal irradiation plus anthracyclines, mediastinal irradiation without anthracyclines, and anthracyclines without radiation. So the additive effect and also the importance of age when we are irradiating these patients, younger patients having a slightly more susceptibility. Also, the fact that there is a wide spectrum of diseases, and which is something that we will be discussing slightly later. Even in diseases where we were not paying attention, as Dr. Kaustav mentioned, for example, non-small cell lung cancer, where now with the advent of additional therapy following chemo, for example, by the addition of the drug durvalumab, we are looking at median survivals, which are over 2 years, nearly 2.5 years. And that's when we realized that the dose received by the heart, specifically the dose received by, the 50 gray dose received by the heart becomes important. And that is, in fact, something that correlates with survival. In this background, may I request one of Dr. Prafulla Kerkar to tell us a bit about the pathophysiology of the radiation-induced cardiac disease. Dr. Prafulla, are you here?
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's nice to collaborate with you oncologists, give a different perspective from the heart point of view. And at the outset, let me congratulate my classmate from pre-med school days, Purvesh, on this initiative. So having said that, now pathophysiology-wise, radiation and heart, if you ask us, we as catheterizers, we are more concerned about exposure during the cardiac cath, that is UVC works and stuff like that. And when you guys tell us that this is there and that thanks to your radiotherapy and chemotherapy, the life expectancy has increased, and that is when you really start tell us so many decades down the line that it is after all radiation and radiotherapy that is also responsible for it. And we're talking in terms of grays and huge scales there. So obviously from a preventive perspective, now again, cause-effect relationship wise, radiation is supposed to affect virtually all the areas of the heart in terms of coronary artery disease, of course, atherosclerosis, radiation induced, or for that matter, at a very preclinical level, if you try to do it, maybe just inflammatory, that coronary arteries would get affected. So people who have risk factors there for usual adult onset coronary artery disease that we talk about, those would be probably at a higher risk that is there. Then it could affect the myocardium directly, so to say. That the myocardial affection, unlike anthracyclines, could be more, it could go on to cause microvascular problems and then get on to fibrosis and therefore LV dysfunction, not necessarily of the kind that we all are aware of, low ejection fractions. People with preserved ejection fractions also, they could have a restrictive cardiomyopathy, in other words, also, as far as the myocardium is concerned. Then, of course, pericardium. We've had some anecdotals, having been next door to Tata's at the KEM hospital. We've had anecdotal cases of constrictive pericarditis also coming very late. But in the acute stages, you can have pericarditis itself, or you may have pericardial effusions.
Very right. Sorry, I think we seem to have lost you, Dr. Kerkar. I think we've just lost you. Yeah.
So Sapna, basically Dr. Kerkar was suggesting that it's a pan business. So it's a pericardium, epicardium, myocardium, along with the neurovascular situation.
Very right.
Everything it is involved. That's what I think Dr. Kerkar was trying to address.
Yeah, that's right. It is a pan affection. Yeah, it's a pan affection of the heart. Sorry, I cut off because my internet is very unstable and I'm on a hotspot with my cell phone. I did mention to Sophia that I may not be able to connect well. So having said that, including valvular heart disease is described, as also having said.
Yeah, very right. Thank you very much, Dr. JP, for your input. I agree that it's a pan, as you mentioned, pan affliction of the heart with pericardium, coronary vasculopathy, then diffuse fibrosis, cardiomyopathy. Also, what is something that is recently a lot of attention to the fact that there is AV node dysfunction and also valvular dysfunction, which may manifest as much as 15 to 16 years later is the median sort of occurrence of the valvular dysfunction. Would the radiation oncologists in the panel, Dr. Indu or Dr. Kaustav, like to say something about what's happening at the cellular level?
Indu, you're taking this?
No, you can take this at the cellular.
Okay. So at cellular level, I think there are multiple effects starting from endothelial damage to micro RNA related problems to oxidative stress to production of cytokines. So these are the four key factors: endothelial damage, production of cytokine, there are a lot of studies talking about overproduction of cytokines due to damage to micro RNAs and the cells having oxidative stress. And they give then of course at a little macro level there is collagen formation and which leads to fibrosis. So these are the factors which affect the heart at various levels, at cellular level and the tissue level.
Very right. So this is some images showing fibrosis, intimal thickening, and as Dr. Kerkar had mentioned, the injury is both macro as well as microvascular. So very often we tend to worry only, or at least in the past, we tended to worry only about myocardium, but actually coronary artery disease is also something that we need to pay attention to. And as you mentioned, oxidative stress and endothelial lining damage. So now I'll come to breast cancer, and I'd like your opinion, Indu, on, we get very divergent views. After all, they very often our medical oncology colleagues will tell us that, we really don't think the heart is so much of a problem. And every now and then there are studies which tell us that, long-term issues have really not been encountered. There are contrarian views also. So do you believe that there is really an issue in terms of needing to protect the heart?
Definitely. I would strongly agree with that because we must understand that breast cancer patients, they have long survival. And sometimes we come across very young patients, say in the 20 to 30 years age group, and most of the patients, younger patients, they have received anthracyclines as well as they receive Herceptin, and then they also go on to hormone treatment. And so many patients come to us with left-sided heart disease, and as we just discussed, that it's not just the myocardium or pericardium which is affected, but it's also the coronary vessels, the small vessels, as well as even the valves. Everything is affected. So, and nowadays we have some patients who have other comorbid problems or intake of smoking, alcohol, then hypercholesterolemia, and intake of all these things, they also lead to cardiac toxicity. So that is why we are always concerned about the cardiac doses, and we try to limit the dose to the not just to the mean heart dose, but the left LAD dose. In fact, dose to the apex or the ventricles. In fact, there is some data coming up which says that it's not just LAD dose which is important.
We'll come to that a little bit, Indu, slightly later. Dr. JP, what is your view? I know this is a controversial subject. So what is your view on, like, is cardiotoxicity or preventing it, is it relevant? Is it important?
I think radiation oncologists traditionally have been respecting OARs.
Yes.
So with increasing life expectancies, it is imperative and mandatory, I will say, that whatever tissues which are beyond the target needs to be protected. Whatever techniques you apply, we need to respect the OARs.
Very right. The basic principles of radiation have to be respected.
Yeah. But my worry is not the local protection, what we do as a radiation oncologist. If I have some foresight, so what will be the distant effect of treating the right-sided breast when nobody is talking about what is the protection of the heart? So
Very right.
definitely there will be some immune effects.
So that is very right, and in fact, our own experience was that when we are treating internal mammary node for right-sided breast cancer, it's interesting to see that even the left anterior descending dose is actually significant. So not only is the right coronary artery dose, significant, but in fact the left anterior descending, especially if you're treating the internal mammary node, is significant. And I think a lot of the issue has been that we've been doing a left versus right analysis, while actually the right itself may have a baseline risk that we are perhaps ignoring. So
Completely agree.
Sorry?
Completely agree on that.
Yes, that's a very valid point. So as survivorship, Indu has alluded to, even from our own, from Tata Memorial, this very significant data, large number of patients followed up and found to have 5-year disease-free survival of almost nearly 70% in locally advanced breast cancer. So breast cancer patients are surviving longer. And besides the traditional things that we are concerned about, adriamycin and trastuzumab, the others also do have a risk of, cardiac effects, including letrozole. We are all aware of that. So with this, I come to the cardiologists. I think we don't know too much about baseline risk assessment. And what is your recommendation? What is the score that we should use, Dr. Naveen Mathew? What is the score that we should use in India for baseline risk assessment?
Ma'am, Dr. Naveen has not joined us yet.
And Dr. Jesu?
Dr. Jesu is there.
So Dr. Jesu, would you please tell us what you think is a good tool for baseline risk assessment?
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you everyone for having me here. My experience actually is quite limited. And but what we kind of generally follow is the risk assessment like we do for other patients also, which includes assessment mainly of risk factors, their age, and whether they have received radiation at a younger age. That's about, and apart from then we go on to further assessing their ECG and any history of arrhythmias or their functional status.
May I interrupt? I just wanted to find out that what is the commonly used risk assessment tool, not for radiation, in general by cardiologists in India? Like, for example, I came to know that QRisk is a British risk assessment tool, factors in whether you are from India or Pakistan. Then Framingham and the other scores have different scores. So is there something that is popular with cardiologists in India?
I think it varies from place to place. I don't think there is any one standard thing. A very common thing which is done in high volume centers in a day-to-day scenario is just a risk factor count. I think that is the most practical thing that is often done.
So would you say, for example, it seems like diabetes seems to go in and out of some scores, like some scores don't include diabetes, some don't include obesity, family history. So do you think that we as radiation oncologists, when we are tabulating, we should be tabulating all of this? Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I think all of these things are very relevant, and the traditional risk factors, including all of these things, diabetes, hypertension, smoking, family history, hypercholesterolemia or dyslipidemia, all of these things are simple things to ask and are absolutely very relevant.
Because now that we have become aware and cognizant of what we have to do, only if we start, collecting data now, our intervention will only give its outcome if we have all the data collected. And I have been looking for these scores and I couldn't find anything which was pertinent to India or also pertinent to anything that was giving a 5-year score. Everything that is discussed is a 10-year score, 10-year risk of having coronary artery disease.
Yes, I think having not all of these things really apply perfectly to Indians just as a clinical score. It's been shown that once you add other things like an imaging modality or something, then the robustness increases. So in the absence of a completely perfect tool, I would think that just sticking to the basics of assessing traditional risk factors would probably be more uniformly followable thing, especially in India, especially since we don't have a score which is derived from our own population. It's based on Western models and through modeling and other things. So rather than going through the pain of trying to apply all those things and then still not being accurate enough, I would think just doing a risk factors count and then maybe supplementing it with simple imaging tools or simple non-invasive means would probably give us more robust information. The other senior people, Dr. Kerkar and others also can possibly.
Dr. Kerkar, would you like to give us your views on this?
I think Dr. Jesu has very much summarized everything. More important, rather than just calculating the risk scores, we need to be aware that we need to have your tick boxes and tick out all these, right? So we got to be extra careful about them. But irrespective of whatever, there is somebody asking over there on the chat box as to how do you say that radiation caused valvular heart disease. It's difficult to have that kind of a cause-effect relationship unless we have large numbers and we have a comparative population. But these things are very important, like diabetes has to be, it is a given that diabetes means we're talking about it's a cardiovascular risk equivalent. Okay, that some score did not have diabetes within it. It is not, by and large, the ASCVD risk, which is available app-based. It's there whether we want to start these guys on a preventive statin therapy for primary prevention. Correct? Right. So that's what it is there for. But within that, anybody who's a diabetic is considered to be a cardiovascular disease equivalent. So the standard 4 things, smoking, hypertension, diabetes, and dyslipidemia ought to get included everywhere.
Right.
In all your tick boxes, they have to be there.
Yeah.
Smoking plus these three.
True. Just
Right.
simply diabetes.
None of these have been tested out in Indian. That's why we do not have our
Very
own.
right. Very right. So in fact, just diabetes has recently been a paper where we've looked at the risk assessment in a very sort of, I should say, very basic calculation. And there is obviously a difference in, diabetic versus non-diabetic patients, as you mentioned, very, so, and interestingly, when we see the risk scores for the 3 different scores they have found, so Framingham is different from Reynolds, is different from ProCam. And I mean, I don't know too much about these scores. We are just reading and trying to figure out what we should use in our practice, which is why, so these have already, as you mentioned, of course, cardiotoxic chemotherapy and previous ischemic heart disease are very important.
Sapna, can I ask something?
Sorry.
So when we, can I have a liberty to ask something?
Of course, Dr. JP, you can take over.
No. So whenever I do an assessment, there has to be an end point, right?
Right.
So what is the end point, or to say that this is the score, then you will have this toxicity? Is it a IHD what we are talking, or a cardiomyopathy we are talking, or autonomic AV node failure we are talking? So this is all general risk assessment. Am I right?
Yes, yes.
And that's what we are trying to apply to radiation also.
So I think what you're trying to tell us, JP, is that, Dr. JP, is that, actually we know very little. We only a few years ago when Laura Darby's paper came over, Sarah Darby's paper came over, which said that the mean heart dose was correlated in this manner. And of course, over the last few years, we understand that that's like a very broad description. There's much more depth to that. And I hope that we can just discuss this. So I'll just, so this is Sarah Darby's paper. For the youngsters in the audience, 2,168 patients, and she found that the rate of coronary event was significantly higher for women treated for left-sided lesions. And with prior diagnosis of ischemic heart disease, the rate ratio was 6.67. And also with diabetes, COPD, smoking, and high BMI. And then it was correlated with, basically, there was a 7.4% increase per Gray, but actually the increase in the first 9 years was much higher, and possibly it was about 16.5% increase per Gray of radiation. This has been further analyzed, and I'll discuss that slightly later. And then of course we know that there is a right versus left, not forgetting that we might be, sort of closing our eyes to the fact that radiation could be causing this 10% dip also. So basically we know that left-sided breast cancer patients have a smaller freedom from coronary artery disease and a smaller freedom from myocardial infarction. And also that the pattern of coronary artery disease changes. So I understand that about 46% of patients, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Kelkar and Dr. Jesu, is it so that there is a significant proportion of patients who would otherwise have RCA-related coronary artery disease, but when they receive radiation, most patients have left anterior descending disease? So
correct.
Yeah. Is that so?
Yeah, it's very hard to kind of separate and kind of like Dr. Kelkar mentioned earlier, the cause and effect thing is extremely hard to prove in these patients because
what I meant to ask, Dr. Jesu, sorry for interrupting.
Sorry.
was
Yes.
that, is it so that otherwise in women who are not irradiated, in the average woman who comes for a coronary angio, there is about 50% have LAD disease and 50% will have other stuff. Is that so?
Yeah. I mean, any of the coronaries can be involved. Yeah, I don't think there is a specific pattern as such.
Fine.
Yeah.
Dr. Sapna, can I just add a point to that?
Sure.
So when we do breast radiation, and you know, the number of breast radiations have increased in India over the last 1 decade, the amount of apex which is coming. So as the LAD descends along the interventricular groove, we have almost 1/3 of LAD coming into our radiation portal, which often the other arteries do not come so often, but LAD definitely does, because you know some amount of the cardiac apex will be there, and invariably around 20 to 30%. So I think that is a major thing which is a cause of this publication or this observation, that patients who have received radiation, and quite a few of them will be breast cancer patients. So I think it will be interesting to understand how many of them were breast cancer and how many were non-breast cancers.
Yeah.
Sapna, just to
This
let you
is
know,
all breast cancer patients that we are
Sapna,
talking about.
Dr. Sayan Das has joined, just to let you know.
Sure. Right. Thank you for letting me know. So we'll go to the next. So these were all, breast cancer patients, left-sided breast cancer patients. So my question now to, Sayan is, what is the strategy that you adopt for reducing the dose, cardiac dose, when you're treating a left-sided breast cancer patient, for example? And do you adopt the same strategy for right-sided?
Thank you, madam. Am I audible?
Yes.
Because there'll be too
Not
much
visible, it seems.
surrounding noise because of these puja celebrations going around. So in our institute, what we are right now doing is, for left-sided breast cancer, routinely we use ABC. There is the active breath coordinator. So it's a way of doing a deep inspiratory breath hold, thereby creating a gap between the heart and the chest wall or the breast tissue, which is able to reduce, as per our own study that we have did as part of one of the students' thesis, that the mean heart doses can be brought down by almost 50% by using DIBH. Regarding LAD doses, it is difficult at times, as Dr. Talapatra said, that yes, close to almost 20 to 30% of the LAD do come into the radiation portals. The other problem that we often face is that routinely we don't use contrast as part of the RT planning scan. So contouring the LAD becomes very challenging. For right-sided, it is not routinely used, but we do record and document the doses to the heart. Are we using separate? I mean, okay, so the next question is, okay, we'll avoid that. So the strategies that we use, one is cardiac shielding using MLCs, if possible, especially for chest walls, which having an acute or a very steep curved chest walls, we do end up using sophisticated techniques. Otherwise, for most breast, a forward plan IMRT is able to achieve acceptable plan with heart doses as low as possible.
Right.
In very fat obese patients, we have tried prone position in, I think, 3 or 4 cases till date. At times, the only problem that we faced was regarding the reproducibility of the contralateral breast, but and heart dose was slightly less with the prone position. That is true.
Very right. So, Dr. Kaustav, what is the strategy that you use to reduce heart doses?
So my primary strategy is DIBH and with RPM system.
Right.
We gate it, and we also have a phase-based gating with our Calypso system. Right. And we are working on a study with DIBH, without DIBH, which we have sent to ISRO. So we have found such a statistically significant results in that. We'll be publishing.
And Indu, what is the strategy that you use to reduce the dose to the left side of the heart?
DIBH. So at
Yeah.
my center also DIBH, and additional what I have started doing is that as a rule, I mean, we coach the patients for 3 to 4 days, and I've also started giving them this जो green ball वाला होता है, I'm just forgetting the name.
Pyrometer. Pyrometer.
Pyrometer, sorry. So I have started coaching the patients to use pyrometer at home so that they get more used to breath hold techniques and it to enhance their lung function also. So this I've additionally started doing, and I've seen in 2-3 patients which I've done recently that as the treatment progresses, their breath holding gets better. So this is one additional thing which I've started doing. I'm not doing prone.
So I think none of us really have been using too much prone, and I think it's to do with the to do with the kind of patients we see, in the sense that most of our patients will require some sort of nodal irradiation, and that is why I think prone is an issue. Dr. JP, are you using prone in Tata?
Very, very rarely.
I agree. Similarly, we also use
I have some serious challenges with the radiation oncologist who are treating breast. It is a moving structure. What you are doing is a snapshot. So you do gating, you do DIBH. So all these are trying to reduce the doses, and you are just approximating a dosage, right? They are not the true doses. Unless you put a TLD inside a coronary, and Dr. Kelkar can definitely put it, measure it in some models. I'm just believing that this is a representative dose. It is not the absolute correct one.
True. We are not accounting even for example, the pulsatile motion and so on. That is true.
Yeah.
Very true.
We must understand that, and we must emphasize to our cardiology colleagues that whatever we are doing is a near representation. It's not a real truth.
In fact, LED movement also happens. It's not just the heart. LED position can also change during treatment.
I'll quickly just discuss a bit of DIBH. So this is our own data. This was done at that time. When we analyzed it, we had 44 patients, and what basically DIBH allows us to do is to increase the distance between the heart and the cardiac structures, and also a change in the shape of the heart and an increase in the lung volume. So at the similar level, at a similar anatomical level, you can see the differences. And basically, so we used a Brainlab based system. This was something that we had developed ourselves at Apollo Delhi. And this is, if I can play it, I'll just try. So basically, this is how the radiation comes on only when the patient has held her breath in that particular phase that you have identified. And of course, people who are swimmers, people who have practiced yoga, they are good candidates and this is the kind of reduction, I mean, very dramatic reduction in various cardiac parameters. Again, LED doses do continue to be high simply because of the location of the LED, but definitely there's a very significant drop in the left ventricle and the heart, various parameters. So I'll come to, I'd like to ask Indu, what is your typical dose constraint prescription? Like, do you have a separate constraint for the cardiac substructures, or do you just give a mean heart dose? So please.
Ma'am, actually we are doing, it's not just the mean heart dose, but definitely it is LED also. So for the left-sided, I mean, although at times we're not able to achieve it, but mean heart dose should be less than 2.5 gray, and LED mean less than 10 gray, volume receiving 30 gray should be close to say 2%, and volume receiving 40 gray to LED should be less than 1%. Similarly, there are some constraints for left ventricle as well. So Dmax for left ventricle should be less than 3, and V5 for the left ventricle should be less than 17%. V23 for left ventricle should be around 5%. These are the different constraints which have been given. In fact, some data is now coming up for differential dosing. I mean, they say that it's not just the total dose to LED which is going, but it's mainly the mid and distal part of LED, which is
very right.
So I'm not doing that. In fact, I think the sub-segments of heart also, and in fact, they say that it's not just left-sided LED, but also the right coronary artery is also, which is important when we are delineating these structures. So I have not been documenting them, but I think I'll start doing that as well.
So this is a bit about the fact that the injury to each of these segments correlates with the risk of left ventricular injury. So whether we are talking about the ventricular segments or the substructures of the coronaries, that is, we do understand that this is something that we have to pay attention to. And typically the doses are in the range of 3 to 4 gray. And then, of course, there is a recent publication which suggests that there's another model instead of Darby's model. Perhaps we should be looking at LVB5, and that may correlate better with our outcomes. And so this is Duane's Atlas. We have started doing that. We marked, this is from one of our patients. We marked this for all our patients, and we hope at some point of time that we'll get some information from this. So at this point of time, I think it's very relevant to talk about proton therapy, because with proton therapy, the doses are really remarkably less. And so whenever there is a very high risk person, such as somebody who has multiple cardiovascular risk factors, obesity, diabetes, etc., these are the kind of doses that we have been able to achieve. And as you can see, the mean heart dose for left-sided breast cancer patients is in the range of 1.1. Right-sided is less than 1. Similarly, the LED doses, even the 0.002, which possibly coincides with where the stenosis happens, is actually really very low, except in one patient in whom we were not able to achieve. But mostly, I would say that these are remarkable values, and these are really not possible with photon-based therapy at this point of time. So this is something, and I'll place this in context with the previous data that I had presented. So if we say V5 gray to the heart, so this is 36, and this becomes 3.1. Similarly, the LED dose is also, dramatically different. So if we say that this might correspond with the 0.2 cc, this is really dramatically different, and that is something that proton therapy allows us to do. I personally feel that if cost and access had not been an issue, I mean, by the Alara principle, I mean, naturally cost and access is an issue, but by the Alara principle, there is no doubt in my mind that this is. So we have recently got permission from our IRB for a registry for a hypofractionated radiation with simultaneous in-field boost. Just yesterday, we have received this, and we will be prospectively looking at cardiac dysfunction. It's, of course, the endpoint is 5 years away, but we have identified, various cardiac parameters, both at the investigation level and at the symptomatic level.
Sapna, can you just highlight one more thing?
Yes.
Dose per fraction is changing.
Yes.
So we are always seeing the total dose. At some point of time, because of the fast forward and those things, you are increasing the total dose per fraction over a short period of time. So these things are also going to be making a big difference.
So I personally feel that if we see the breast-only studies, Even the way the target is being delineated in these studies is kind of making, like the hard dose actually, excuse me, so many UK studies talk about doses of 1.5, and there's been recently one that has been replicated in the Middle East. So I presume that the way the target is being delineated is different. And I'm curious, do you go to the rib pleural interface for chest wall, or do you all go to the chest wall rib interface? I think that makes all the difference.
Ma'am, may I ask one thing? Do you have separate constraints for a patient for whom we are giving breast, chest wall, SCF, IMC? Are there any different constraints? I tried to find it. JP sir might also help.
So I don't see, the thing about this is, and I want to take Kaustubh's opinion on this also, and also Dr. JP's opinion and Sayan, that, I mean, this is not the spinal cord, this is not the parotid, you understand? We accept what we get.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we accept what we get. We tell the physics team, "Jitna kam kar sakte ho, please bring it down." After that, we accept, even if it's 8 or it's 9, we still accept it. We go ahead with the treatment. What do you have to say about that?
Yes, ma'am. I just one point with respect to what JP sir said. The 10-year results of the FAST trial, which gave once a week for 5 weeks, is now available, which has reported no significant increase in the cardiac events. So we are still awaiting long-term results of the FAST forward, but FAST results till now show no significant increase.
So, Dr.
Sapna, apologies. We are running out of time, so if you can conclude, please.
Yes, please. So I will skip esophageal then, except to say that there is recently a randomized trial that has concluded that the total toxicity burden in esophageal can be reduced by proton therapy, and the toxicity there quite significantly, 15 to 20% of patients who receive IMRT do have some cardiac issues. There are cohort studies also which tell us. And then there are others, of course, thymoma, lung, where it is important. I just want one last opinion from our cardiologists. Is there something, the two questions that if you could answer, Dr. Kerkar, do you think metformin, statins, and pentoxifylline have a preventive role?
I doubt very much for primary prevention to prevent a radiation-induced disease as such. None of these would have a role, though there is some little data with pentoxifylline and also statins for that matter. And having said that, if you really think that your patient has developed some LV dysfunction, then yes, meaning primarily, if at all there is data for ACE inhibitors and beta blockers, ACE ARBs or beta blockers, the usual heart failure therapy, there is some data on primary prevention with them. So having said that, once you develop overt heart failure in the symptomatic patients with radiation-induced disease, that is to say cardiotoxicity, then yes, these are exciting times. As far as when you talk about metformin, which is used for anything and everything, there is some data there. But for treatment of heart failure as such, an anti-diabetic molecule today, like this, the SGLT2 inhibitor has become like a cardiovascular drug. So heart failure therapies have improved, but as primary prevention, all these therapies at what stage, we don't even know as to it is going to happen, it's not going to happen. But I only just one message out here in keeping with the World Heart Day slogan. Radio-oncologists use heart to beat heart disease due to radiation. Use heart to beat heart disease is what is the slogan. But you guys have to be almost always aware that when you are giving radiation out there, decades down the line, heart disease does occur in these patients, and there is enough data from the Western world as well as your own data which says that heart does get affected. So be aware of the risk factors, be extra careful. We are just learning about the science of oncocardiology, that is to say, and that collaboration is extremely important.
Dr. Parekh, do I have time for one small question, or should I?
We have already exceeded by 4 minutes.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that we don't have too much here to judge how to, assess. So maybe echocardiogram with the global longitudinal strain, which is not something I understand exactly. But in any case, some other time, whenever there is a discussion about this. So we basically have to be cognizant. We have to be aware of our risk assessment constraints and technique. I'd like to thank all my panelists for the stimulating discussion. I'd also like to thank Dr. JP for his counsel, wise counsel, and also Dr. Vivek Agarwal and Dr. Purvish Parekh for giving all of us the opportunity to discuss this subject.
Thank you, Sapna. I think you did a wonderful job. I really congratulate Dr. Parekh and the whole Vivek to bring everybody on this forum. I think it's the need of the hour. Thank you, Dr. Parekh, and thank you, Sapna, and thank you all the panelists, right from Sayan, Kaustav, Dr. Ketkar, Dr. Jesu, and everybody. Thank you again for this wonderful panel.
Thank you, sir.
JP sir, can I request you to please moderate the question and answers? They're there on the screen, sir.
Okay. No, I can't see only part of it. Okay. So this is a question which has come from Dr. Rajendra Kumar. So as we know, the cardiotoxicity is closely associated with the renal toxicity. How come no nephrologist is on the team? And how endocrinologist as well as the cardiac problem as a risk factor for cancer? I feel every cancer patient is a potential cardiac patient and vice versa. Any blood measure to viscosity in cancer patient? I think Dr. Ketkar, you would like to take it? Dr. Ketkar?
Ketkar sir, you'll have to.
Hello, yes, please. What is the question? Could you come again? I did not really understand the question.
The question is essentially he's trying to say that there should be a multidisciplinary team of the specialists with the nephrologist also. And are there any regimen for reducing the blood viscosity in these patients? So essentially, please go ahead, Dr. Ketkar.
Sir, you have to unmute your mic, sir. Dr. Ketkar, you have to unmute your mic.
Yes, I would just talk about blood measures as such to reduce blood viscosity in cancer patients. Meaning you got to keep them well hydrated is one thing that I would talk about. And if at all there is a role of, meaning if you're referring to, Dr. Jesu might add there, if you're referring to thromboembolism that is there with cancer patients, with that prophylactic anticoagulation is one way to go about it, if at all. This is besides the point that we are discussing. Dr.
Yeah, absolutely, sir. I don't have anything more to say.
I think I completely agree with Dr. Ketkar and Dr. Jesu that people have tried, especially in the GI malignancies, using blood thinners. Let me put it in a very common parlance. But there is not much big data across the sites, like in a head neck or something. But a patient who is going to be disabled for or lying on the bed for quite some time, I think there is some level of evidence in that to use
NOACs.
So the next question is Dr. Fossa.
Especially NOACs. There is some data with NOACs.
Yes, sir. So the next question is for Dr. Sapna. What are the dose levels received by thyroid that too has an effect on cardiac function?
Yes, that's true. So there is definitely, especially when we are treating supraclavicular lymph nodes, there is definitely dose received by the thyroid. And yes, patients who are hypothyroid can have cardiac issues. However, I think the basic thing has to be like for head neck radiation, when we are treating patients for breast cancer, we have to be cognizant of it. So we know that they already have risk factors, for example, menopause and menopause especially. So we have to be cognizant of that. That is true.
Yes, that is true. But in the same light, do you want to comment that both thyroid needs to receive a really significant amount of dose, which actually doesn't happen even if you treat supraclav, ipsilateral supraclav. So already in a compromised thyroid, we may see a hypothyroidism, right, Dr. Satna?
Yes, very right. But we have to be cognizant of it, you know, so we
Yes.
have to measure the TSH in patients who are on follow-up.
So there is a next question. I think, so how do you distinguish between a valvular lesion and its symptoms attributable to radiation oncology and not to a simple degenerative over the time, long period of time? So any cardiologist would like to take?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So I basically look after the echo lab in a high volume center, and often when we are moving from cubicle to cubicle, we see a lot of valve disease. And this is a question which immediately comes to mind, and often there are no clinical details also. So there are certain patterns which probably point towards valve involvement due to radiation disease. And one of the classic patterns which has been described and which we see rarely, not very commonly, is involvement of the aortomitral curtain. And so it's mainly the left-sided valves which are involved, which is the mitral and the aortic valve. Usually there is some amount of regurgitation, and usually you see involvement of the base of the leaflets, and especially this aortomitral curtain involvement is quite typical. And then we retrospectively go back and ask, have you ever received radiation? Because usually by then patients have also forgotten that they've had any kind of malignancy in the past. That is the kind of scenario that we are talking about. And usually radiation and malignancy has slipped way down into their list of problems which they have gathered over the years. So these are practical things that I'm saying. And yes, then the patient recalls, yes, maybe 20 years back I received radiation. Having said that, another close thing which will come would be patients with CKD who will almost have a similar kind of, these are two groups of patients where we've kind of found similar kind of valve involvement.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. We will have a short time, so we'll take another question. Can pericardial effusion occur as an adverse effect of radiation like constrictive pericarditis? Will you like to take again, sir?
Yeah, sure. So again, immediately post radiation, I mean, again, we do about 300 echoes a day and currently around 150. So don't really encounter a situation where a patient has had radiation and then we are having to do an echo to rule out an effusion. So probably it happens, but then probably it goes unnoticed also because we are not actively looking for effusion in every patient who receives. That is what I would think. And remotely, when patients do present with constriction, then especially when they have associated myocardial disease, I mean, a lot of echo parameters we look at, and there are certain pointers which kind of tell us that there is an added myocardial disease also. And one of the questions that we definitely ask is a history of radiation in the past. And so it is in that scenario that we may find myopericardial involvement, but acutely, like acute pericarditis, hardly ever. I haven't really, maybe Dr. Kerkar can add on to that.
So Dr.
No, even I haven't seen any. Yeah, even I haven't seen any acute pericarditis radiation related as such. But yes, having said that, constrictive pericarditis patient and some little myocardial involvement also. And then when you go back retrospectively on the history, sometimes you also get it. And you are supposed to, as a rule out, talk about no history of radiation in the past for any constrictive pericarditis patient that we deal with. isn't it? So constrictive pericarditis, yes, but I haven't seen pericarditis as such. But right at the outset, we did mention that is the pan affection of the heart with radiation that you see. Every other structure in the heart, including the conduction system, can get involved with radiation. Though there is so much talk about LAD involvement and left breast cancers and stuff like that. So the most important thing out here is that heart radiation to the heart seems sort of unavoidable, and it has got to be there. And somewhere down the line, if you get a patient 10 years down the line post, he's got a good survival today because of thanks to your therapies. And if he has come, then cause effect wise, we will retrospectively obviously say that it is related to radiation, especially if he does not have the usual risk factors for coronary artery disease and yet has got coronary artery disease. One could always attribute it to radiation. Or for that matter, if he has come with heart failure today, myocardial involvement and heart failure as a presentation and got nothing else except for history-wise radiation, and especially if he's got thoracic cancers, so to say, and has had radiation.
So Sapna,
that is how we will talk about a cause-effect relationship.
Yeah. Sapna, do you see a pericardial effusion in your practice secondary to radiation?
I don't remember having seen. I mean, it's not that I may not. I don't think I remember having seen over the last at least 10, 15 years. I do have a vague memory of seeing something many years ago. But okay, I just want to say something, not for breast, but for esophagus I have seen. I mean, I remember distinctly, this is a few years ago, seeing an 80-year-old woman whom we treated, and she died a month later, and she had a pericardial effusion, and I did ask myself.
Sorry to interrupt.
So JP sir, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. So we're running out of time.
I'll just ask everybody, all radiation oncologists, now you please go back and see your review of your scans, whom you have treated for follow-up. You will definitely see some rim of effusion, though they are not symptomatic. So that's the food for thought.
Thank you very much, JP. Thank you. We have to move to the next session, please.
Yes, sir.
Ashish, go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, JP sir. Thank you, Sapna ma'am, and thank you to all the panelists. We'll move on to the case presentation. Our chairperson for the session is Dr. Sudeep Gupta, Senior Medical Oncologist from Mumbai. Thank you so much, sir, for agreeing to chair the session. We request you to please introduce our case presenter. Over to you, sir.
So thank you very much, Kashish, for your kind introduction. We have a very nice case presentation by my colleague, Dr. Chandrakant, who was earlier my erstwhile colleague at Tata Memorial Center and is now at the Narayana Hospital in Kolkata. And he will be presenting a case on paclitaxel-induced cardiac toxicity. So I request Dr. Chandrakant to please make the presentation.
Thank you so much, sir, for the introduction. So in the coming 5 minutes, we will see a case, a real world case we came across in practice. So she was a 62-year-old lady, postmenopausal. She was diabetic and controlled with metformin. She was non-hypertensive. She was obese with a BMI of 30 kg per meter square. She didn't have any prior symptoms of heart disease. She was on metformin, atorvastatin, ecosprin, and Ensure protein powder. And her systemic examination was unremarkable, except she had a blood pressure of 144 by 90 millimeters mercury. JVP was not raised. Cardiac examination was fine. She had a left-sided breast lump, which was fixed to the skin and had a matted lymph node. This was basically post 4 cycles of dose-dense anthracycline cyclophosphamide chemotherapy. She had an edematous left upper limb, which was there mild, and she reports nearly 50% reduction in the size of the breast lump post 4 cycles of dose-dense AC. So this were the hematologic parameters. Just to note that she had a lower MCV, hemoglobin was low, and she had a transferrin saturation of 19%. B12 and folate were fine. So she had some amount of iron deficiency, anemia, and the lipid profile had hypertriglyceridemia and a higher LDL. And then renal function was normal, LFT was fine, albumin was fine. The sugars had a borderline high fasting blood sugar with a HbA1c of 7.2%. ECG and 2D echo was fine. We didn't do the echo post 4-cycle anthracycline. This was the baseline 2D echo and ECG which we have. And this was the biopsy report, which was a strongly hormone positive breast cancer. And it was discussed in a joint clinic where it was a larger lump, required a bigger resection. So we planned for completing the whole neoadjuvant chemotherapy with 12 cycles of weekly paclitaxel at 80 milligram per meter square, and then evaluate for surgery. And this is the way we give. She had iron deficiency, so we supplement iron before chemotherapy. So she initially received ferric carboxy maltose 1000 milligrams, and then she received all the pre-medications: dexamethasone, granasetron, promethazine, ranitidine, and then we gave paclitaxel 120 milligrams in the codon set over 1 hour. So during the infusion, she tolerated the iron well. The pre-medications were all fine, except she felt a bit drowsy with promethazine infusion, and she tolerated the initial 20 minutes of paclitaxel well. Later on, she developed shortness of breath and chest discomfort. First, we thought of hypersensitivity being the most common thing which we come across. So she was afebrile, she had tachycardia with a higher blood pressure, and the saturation had fallen down to 88% with room air. And she had diffuse rhonchi, and there were also crepitations. And the cardiovascular, muffled heart sounds with tachycardia, there were no murmurs. So immediately the paclitaxel infusion was stopped, proper position, oxygen inhalation was given. We took care of the component of hypersensitivity by giving Avil and hydrocod and furosemide and Duolin, and she was shifted to CCU in view of continued desaturation. So she was in ECG, she was found to have sinus tachycardia. She had left ventricular hypertrophy with the ST segment depression and T wave flattening in the anterior leads. And these were new findings in comparison to the previous ECG. The drop I was positive. And the echo did show regional wall motion abnormality with ejection fraction of 35%. So she was managed in cardiac care unit with diuretics, antihypertensives. She was given atorvastatin, aspirin, clopidogrel, and heparin. She symptomatically improved. She was planned for coronary angiography. However, there was some logistic constraint with the patient, and they were not able to accept that it was a new onset cardiac event. They thought it was all drug induced and it would resolve on itself, and she got stabilized and shifted to ward. She clinically improved, and then as the time went on, on day 4, the T waves normalized. The ST depression did persist for some time, and then the echo showed improvement in ejection fraction to 50%, and then she was discharged. So we had a definite event of we had definite cardiac event. So we thought, should we change it to further a cremorpher free paclitaxel, or should we use a fancy aquagenic docetaxel, or should we go ahead with surgery? We had an extensive discussion, different opinions from different colleagues. Then we mailed personally to Dr. Sudeep. So he came up with an opinion where we could give her a neoadjuvant hormonal therapy for 3 months, and then we can see. And we did give, and did she have continued response? And then she underwent MRM and radiation, and then she's present in letrozole in her last follow-up and has completed 2 years of letrozole, and she's keeping well, and she's in CR in September 2020. So we give so many paclitaxel every day, and we have so many things in mind. This is the things which comes into. So was it really a non-STEMI, or was it hypersensitivity that precipitated the event? Was it due to paclitaxel, or was it due to cremorpher? Did iron, Finargon, or granasetron, which prolongs QT, did it precipitate the event? Did obesity and diabetes contribute? Did prior anthracycline, did it add any risk? Did dose dense and PEG filgrastim, which we gave, did it reduce the clearance of taxane, or has it got anything to do with toxicity? So should we routinely do 2D echo post 4 cycles of AC in all breast cancer patients? Should we change atorvastatin to rosuvastatin because of reduced clearance of doxorubicin, or should we switch to from letrozole to tamoxifen right now? So with these questions, I would leave the session and we can discuss it. and I would hand over back to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you so
thank
much,
you.
sir. Yeah, please go ahead, sir. Please go ahead.
So thank you very much, Chandrakant. That was a very nice presentation, and actually your questions were absolutely spot on.
Yes,
And I think the discussant will have a hard time, giving answers to those questions. So I will now request my colleague, Dr. Anuprita Dadi, who's an internal medicine specialist in Mumbai in Tata Memorial, to discuss this case.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, good evening. Nice case presentation, Chandrakant. It's a very interesting case. First of all, what you said, it was 62 years female, means she was old age, she had diabetes, she had obesity. Her BP was 144/90. So, and also she had received 4 cycles of anthracycline. So I guess for such kind of patients, we would go ahead with baseline, echo after anthracycline before planning further. But now we were planning paclitaxel. And with paclitaxel, we are not expecting any cardiomyopathies. We generally don't see. We see QT prolongations or bradycardias or arrhythmias. These things are more commonly seen with this types of with paclitaxel. So I would like to share. I would like to share this. Is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Yes.
Yeah, so coming to paclitaxel and cardiotoxicity, so the major side effects that oncologists know, they're bone marrow suppression, alopecia, polyneuropathy, and cardiac toxicity. And basically, cardiac toxicity is asymptomatic bradycardia or AV blocks, which we generally see, QT prolongation. And fatal myocardial infarction is very rare, like cardiac ischemia and myocardial infarction due to coronary vasospasm is reported incidence is 0.26% in literature. And paclitaxel related cardiotoxicity is increased among patients with high risk features like diabetes, hypertension, also patient who has received radiotherapy to chest wall. So in your case, patient was obviously more than 60 years of age, also had received previous cardiotoxic drug anthracycline. And the mechanism of paclitaxel-induced cardiotoxicities occurs either indirectly following a massive histaminic release with subsequent conduction disturbances and arrhythmia. Though the direct myocardial damage via effect or on cellular organelles, which may induce congestive heart failures. So studies have showed that most important acute arrhythmogenic effect of paclitaxel is QT interval prolongation followed by bradycardia and then atrial fibrillation. Also, in your case, it is difficult to distinguish between cardiotoxicity of paclitaxel versus crimaphore formulation in which it was suspended, because it also causes histaminic release, stimulates H1 and H2 receptors, which again increases myocardial oxygen demand, coronary vasoconstriction, and chronotropic effect. Also, H2 antagonists are used as a pre-medication and can themselves lead to cardiac arrhythmias, particularly in patients with advanced age, severe systemic illness, and renal dysfunction. Also, paclitaxel was being, as I said earlier, was combined with a cardiotoxic agent such as anthracycline. So the enhanced effect of cardiotoxic with this combination is probably related to pharmacokinetic interaction, in which crimaphore lowers the renal or hepatic clearance of anthracycline, resulting in their increased plasma level. Or sometimes alternative hypothesis suggests that taxanes stimulate formulation of doxorubicin, that is a toxic metabolite of doxorubicin in the heart. So in summary, myocardial damage secondary to paclitaxel infusion, serious and life-threatening effect. And it in literature there are hardly cases. I mean, till date 6 cases are reported which causes MI, and so one has to keep that thing in mind, that though we generally feel that the cardiotoxicum only anthracycline or this thing, you should keep that in mind, that paclitaxel can cause vasospasm other than 5-FU and all. So you have to be very cautious about it. And also angiography would have helped in this patient. And I would suggest if prior also, if considering age, diabetes, obesity, risk factors, a baseline BP was also 140/90, would have better if you would have done base echo and angiography. And I hope now, if at present, if you're considering her disease-wise, her prognosis if is good, then ideally she should go ahead with coronary angiography and rule out any other cardiac underlying cardiac disorder for long term. She should not again face such kind of issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anuprita. Do we have Dr. Jaya Ghosh?
Yes, sir, I'm there. I think there is some connection with my internet, so I would request the organizers to please share the screen.
Hi, ma'am. I've shared the screen. I hope it's visible.
Okay, perfect. So my colleague, Dr. Jaya Ghosh, will now discuss. And Jaya, we need some answers to the very interesting questions that Chandrakant posed in the beginning. And, you know, I'm also scratching my head. So I hope to.
So thank you, Vivek and Chandrakant. It has really been challenging. Let's see, I have also tried to search for a few things. So I think regarding mechanism of cardiac toxicity, Anuprita has already very well alluded to regarding the mechanisms, whether it's direct paclitaxel related or chemophore related histamine release. And also, as she mentioned, you know, that ranitidine, cimetidine have also been associated with case reports of bradycardia. And same is true for ondansetron that we really use as a pre-medication. So we should bear in mind all these factors in addition to the fact that it could be caused by paclitaxel. Next slide, please. Yes, so what is interesting is, and I think Chandrakant had asked this question regarding re-challenge. So the reported incidence of bradyarrhythmias with paclitaxel is close to 30%. But these were done during the initial days of paclitaxel, you know, when it was administered and people were afraid of it causing hypersensitivity reactions, and these were more largely asymptomatic. So if a patient has an asymptomatic maybe bradyarrhythmia, and many of these patients were in the initial studies were actually re-challenged, and there, you know, they tolerated it. I mean, this were just incidentally detected bradyarrhythmias where they were not. However, like in this patient where she had an MI, and some of the reported cases have also had a fatal MI, this patient recovered, and same was the case with one of our institute also where we had this patient, but they could be fatal. So if a patient has had a fatal MI or has a significant bradyarrhythmia, although there is no literature, but I think given the toxicity, that should probably not be re-challenged. And as was mentioned that in different studies, the incidence has been reported of significant cardiac events from anywhere between 1 to 5%. And of course, this is increased if they have an underlying cardiac disease. And also important to remember is underlying electrolyte imbalances, especially when we are giving it with platinums in cases of ovarian cancer. And one interesting question was increased with anthracycline. So that was more when they were given concurrently. So that is why we don't any longer use any concurrent use of anthracyclines and taxanes. However, if they are used sequentially, then that risk is not increased. So because we have a sequential mechanism where we've used dosins followed by pacli, so I do not think that would have per se led to an increase in the incidence of cardiac toxicity. Although, as we mentioned that, you know, in some of the initial, whether after anthracycline, when we give cardiac toxicity, whether that could possibly lead to an increased incidence in cardiac risk. There were some thoughts, but the meta did not bear that out. And it is also interesting to know that, in fact, patients whom we do have low ejection fraction, so in those patients, paclitaxel can safely be used. I mean, in fact, that is what we use taxanes therapy in whom we want to avoid anthracyclines because of high cardiac risk. In patients, it was shown by monitoring by Muga that, the change was not more, and it could be delivered to those who had a dysfunction. So next slide, please. And of course, because one of the questions I think was whether we can re-challenge with docetaxel, but there are reports of rhythm abnormalities, angina, and reduced ejection fraction, even with the use of docetaxel. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So another interesting question which Chandrakant asked was whether we should routinely do an echocardiogram after 4 cycles of an anthracycline. So 4 cycles of AC was effectively means that we are using 240 milligram per meter square of doxorubicin. So we have the two ASCO and the ESMO. So if you look at the ASCO guidelines, now 240 per se alone is a low risk for cardiac toxicity. But then we also have to look at other factors like, if there are two cardiac comorbidities like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, or dyslipidemia, any two of these, or the patient is greater than 60, or as we just discussed, you have a low dose radiation, but it is involved, the heart is coming into the field. So various of these factors, make the patient at an increased risk of cardiac toxicity. And they look at, the ESMO guidelines, the recently published. So they have said that the risk of, we should do a periodic 2D echo evaluation. And although they haven't specified what cutoff, but if you see that asymptomatic drop in ejection fraction, which is, that is any significant drop in ejection fraction, which may or may not be symptomatic, that is a drop of more than 10 to 15% or to less than 50%. Now, if you see, that is about 7% at 200 milligram per meter square, and it goes up to almost 16% at 400 milligram per meter square. So effectively, what we are trying to say is that even though at 240 milligram per meter square, the incidence of CHF may be 1 to 2%, the incidence of a significant drop in LV dysfunction is 7%. Now, if you look at the previous data was presented by our keynote speaker regarding the cardiotoxicity and the cardiotox, we really do not know what is the actual incidence of those patients who have a normal ejection fraction and would be, in the mild to moderate category of cardiac toxicity. So I think it is important to bear in mind that yes, we should do a repeat 2D echo after 4 cycles of an anthracycline-based therapy, and mainly also from the point of view to prevent and to early intervention and early strategies to prevent further cardiac damage, because once we have a CHF, then reversing that may be more difficult. And another interesting thing is that those who are at high risk, even if their ejection fraction is normal at the end of therapy, about 12% go on to develop on follow-up low ejection fraction. So probably these are the ones whom we would have picked up had we done other markers like GLS or the biomarkers, but that is also to be borne in mind. And some of the recommendations do say that you should monitor for those with high risk who are at high risk of developing cardiac toxicity, repeated 2D echo 6 months and then 1 year down the line after the end of therapy. So, and next slide, please. So that is so much for, I think, at the end of 4 cycles of EC, definitely, and we should look at how, whether we should be for high risk patient doing an echo at least 6 months or 1 year down the line. Okay, so next I would like to come on to the question of the last question where he mentioned whether aromatase inhibitors or tamoxifen. And the issue with here is that if you look at the AI meta-analysis, and majority of the meta-analysis, they have shown that the AIs have not, previous slide, please. Previous slide, yeah. So the AIs have not significantly increased the risk of cardiac deaths. There were, I think, a difference in cardiac deaths was not significant. However, I would just like you to focus on the fact that here if you have mortality without recurrence, and if you look at the hazard ratios for mortality without recurrence, the relative risk goes from 0.8 to 1.07. So why is that? Even though we have a reduction in breast cancer mortality, the reduction in deaths without recurrence, that is non-breast cancer mortality, really doesn't reach significance. And if anything, if you look at the hazard ratios, they are crossing, and at least the 10-year gain, it is almost up to,
I think Jaya, you will have to end because, maybe you can quickly wrap up.
Yeah, okay. So one last slide, and this is like, this was in a trial setting. And if you look at the slides, here in a general population, the use of AIs as compared to tamoxifen has led to a significant increase in several cardiovascular risks. And last slide. So I think we need to have a careful history for cardiovascular risk factors, and both bradyarrhythmias and rarely MI can occur with taxanes. And AIs are associated with an increased cardiovascular risk in the population-based settings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh. That was a very nice presentation.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Sudeep sir, can I request you to please moderate the Q&As?
Yeah, so I will do that, and I have read most of the things that were in the chat box. So maybe no need to show the slides. I will just summarize, and I believe we have already over time, so I will just take a couple of minutes. So one question from many different, or one comment rather, from many different people on the chat box was that we should have done some sort of a coronary imaging, and even if it was not possible during that event and during the treatment, it might have been done subsequently. And I think there was some discussion on whether a CT angio might have sufficed, and the comment from the cardiologist was that not during the acute event, it could have been done later, but of course the conventional coronary angiography might have been better. Are there any other comments? And I think there is one question from our organizer, Dr. Vivek Agarwala, and he asked whether in a patient who has a cardiovascular event, would it be safe to give aromatase inhibitor, and what's the risk benefit ratio versus tamoxifen? So I think that question was addressed to me, Vivek. Should I answer it, or should I ask Jaya to answer it?
Sir, anyone can answer, but the thing is that, sir, that AIs have a higher cardiovascular event risk. And does this higher risk balance against the DFS benefit as compared to tamoxifen? And secondarily, sir, if somebody is on adjuvant letrozole and has a cardiovascular event, whether we should change to tamoxifen or we should continue letrozole with cardiovascular care?
So I think, Jaya very nicely showed that even though the breast cancer deaths were reduced because of AI, for some reason, all-cause deaths are not reduced, and that can only be if non-breast cancer deaths are actually increased with AI. So, my own take on that issue is that AI possibly is the more effective anti-breast cancer drug, but it also increases at least slightly the the non-breast cancer mortality. And in each patient, we have to figure out what is the competing risk of cardiovascular versus breast cancer mortality. So, if a woman has 8 lymph nodes positive, is nicely ER positive, then I would say that even with some cardiovascular risk, perhaps AI would be the better treatment. But if you've been giving somebody AI, with a 1.8 centimeter node negative tumor, and if there is a cardiovascular risk, I think it would be better to change to tamoxifen. So I believe that there may not be one correct answer to that question, and there may be several, but in general, I don't think that an cardiovascular risk is a contraindication to AI, and I would definitely not, in a knee-jerk manner, change everybody from AI to tamoxifen. I will evaluate the individual risk of competing events and then take that call. Kashish, are there any more questions that I've missed out? I think coronary imaging was the one, and is there anything else?
Sir, I think you've covered all the questions, sir.
Okay, excellent. So I suppose we hand over back to you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Dr. Jaya, Dr. Anuprita, and Dr. M.V. Chandrakant as well. I now request the Asian Cardio-Oncology Society Honorary Secretary, Dr. Vivek Agarwal, to please give the vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, I again thank all the participants for participating today. There is already festive season, and I really am very thankful that you could find out time to participate. Special thanks to Dr. Anuprita, who last minute covered for us because Dr. Anand Pandey was not able to participate due to certain emergency issue. I once again congratulate all the faculties for giving us such a wonderful discussion, and thank you again for sparing the time. I once again invite all the participants, if you have not taken membership, please take membership with the Asian Cardio-Oncology Society. You can get the information on www.acos.info, and wish you a very, very happy Navratri and Durga Puja, and good night. Thank you.